Ladies and gentlemen, we are live, coming to you from Matt Buchanan Studios, brought to you by me, Matt Buchanan. Follow us on Facebook and YouTube at Matt Buchanan Studios and Matt Buchanan Comedy. Check the episode description for links to all of my, as well as my guests' social media handles. Quaco Inc. is the official sponsor of the show. Quaco is also the official sponsor of my upcoming book release entitled An Explanation for Life, the Universe, the Brain, the Mind, and Consciousness. Available soon from over 30,000 retailers in over 100 countries. Quaco is also the official sponsor of the hot new board game, 33 Degrees of Order and Chaos, coming soon exclusively to Amazon Prime. This is Laugh Therapy, and I am the Comedy Doctor. Stay happy and healthy, folks, and enjoy the episode.
Roger, 0J, and I feel fine. Liftoff and the clock has started.
Part 2. I'm going to be quick about this. Endophenotype modeling of behavioral subtypes in children. So this is part of my PhD. This is the last bit of my PhD. And my role here was to evaluate a database that had about 300 twins that had been evaluated at age 12, all twins, for psychiatric conditions. So they all underwent extensive psychiatric evaluations for things like anxiety, depression, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, XYZ. They all had brain imaging, electroencephalography. They all had psychiatric evaluations. They all gave cortisol, like saliva, they gave saliva to measure cortisol, stress. They gave all kinds of markers. My job here was to analyze all of the electroencephalography data. So there was 250 patients that had electroencephalography, 252, and ultimately there was 189 patients that had brain imaging and a complete psychiatric review. So my full data set that I've been working with for the last couple of years is 189 patients. I had all their brain data and I had all their psychiatric data. Now, using that database, I can start to look for subtypes based on, or phenotypes based on their electrophysiological or electroneurophysiological profiles. So every one of these children, I have a profile of their psychiatry, and then I have all these markers in their brain. And what we want to do then is we say, how do we match the brain profile to the psychiatric profile? And can we create subgroups based on each of these? And that's what we've done using traditional statistical models, but also in the last year, we've been applying new machine learning models that is evaluating psychiatric data compared with the brain data and deriving new patterns from machine learning using particularly support vector machines, gradient boosted trees, and some deep learning models that are able to tell us something about the relationship between the brain profile and the psychiatric profile. This is what I love this stuff. This is what I want to do and focus my future on, but all the while pairing that with brain stimulation. So once you find those things, you can use brainstim to help fix that. Okay, I'm just going to skip this slide. It's just about the methods that we used, which was important for Harvard, less important for you guys. So we hypothesized that there would be a relationship between the behavioral, the psychiatric subtypes, and the electrophysiology. And we also hypothesized that there would be a concordance among twin pairs, which means they were all twins, so let's not forget that. So not only do we have all this amazing data for phenotypes, but we also can look at the genetic relationship, the genotype between the brain profile of one twin and the psychiatric profile, and the same genetics in a monozygotic twin and their psychiatric profile compared to their brain profile. And we had some dizygotic twins. It's about half and half, where the dizygotic twin shares 50% of their DNA, and a monozygotic twin, in other words, an identical twin, they share 100% of their DNA. So then we had dizygotic twins who are sharing 50%, and then we can compare their psychiatric profile and their brain profile. Just, it's amazing. And we've got 189 of them, so it's a good amount, it's a good power to actually start to determine these types of relationships. Absolutely exciting. That's it for study 4. That's all I'm saying about it now, because it's cutting edge. It's coming out. It's new, and I can't say too much about it anyway. So that's what we're doing. Study 5. It's also just one slide. This is all I'm saying about this one. About this study is on this slide. It's already published. This was the team from the private clinic. Study 5 and 6 are both about the private clinic. Refill. In this study, what we looked at was, like I said, it was an epidemiological study. So the polytrauma clinical triad is the combination of post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic pain, and post-concussion syndrome. In other words, it's post-traumatic stress disorder and chronic pain as a result of some brain injury. This is why it's commonly been reported in military populations, particularly post-combatant military, so people who've come home from deployment. If they were exposed to a brain injury, like a blast, let's say a blast-related injury, that's a force impact. Blast sends a force impact, and then a blunt injury is like when you actually hit the head with something blunt. And then you also have rotation injuries, which is when the head shakes and the brain smashes into the skull like a yolk inside of an egg, and it's like this. All these brain injuries, a lot of people recover from them just fine. So let's start with that. Probably about 75% of people recover from a mild brain injury, a concussion. So those are the types of concussions I'm describing: a blunt force, this rotation, or a force injury from changes in pressure, basically. Now, it's possible, of course, to have a more intense brain injury, and those are called moderate brain injuries or severe brain injuries. That implies things like skull fractures, contusions, which is like bleeding in the brain, and strokes and things that can result from that. That happening is moderate, severe brain injury. What's known in the scientific literature as mild traumatic brain injury is synonymous with concussion. Concussion and mild traumatic brain injury mean the same thing according to scientific literature. It's just different ways of calling it. So these are people, you experience a concussion, but at the same time, that might be a very traumatizing event, especially in post-combat, like in war. So you have this traumatic event that's occurring, you're having a brain injury occur to you, and it's probably painful. Those three things comprise the polytrauma clinical triad, but it's the triad that becomes exposed in people who continue to suffer. Like months later, they're still in pain, they still have symptoms of brain injury, they still have post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So there's indications of what might develop that. So when you think about the etiology of this, the cause, and you compare a car accident to that car accident, it's very similar in terms of the trauma and the mechanisms. Car accident, brain injury occurs, a sudden onset of pain occurs, you're in pain right away, and you might have a post-traumatic event or stress disorder develop from the trauma in that event. It can be very traumatic, and there's certain things that can predict that. So if you get into a car accident and you pull over and you're like, okay, well, that was rough, unfortunate, bad part of my day, I guess I'll deal with this now, and you're kind of calm about it. Versus if you get into a car accident and you're in a panic and you're crying and you don't know what to do and you're really that can predict, which I'm not saying that's in any way an abnormal behavior, inappropriate behavior. It definitely happens to a lot of people. But if that is the response, you're it's shown in literature, based on that, like you can use that to predict whether or not somebody might develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Versus if you feel pain, and when you feel pain, you can use it to predict whether or not you might develop pain, like chronic pain that keeps on going. So all these people have that, so our study showed that we used 71 patients who had all been in car accidents, and from this epidemiological point of view, we showed that these people also had polytrauma clinical triad to a good extent, and that this triad led to more compounding side effects than one of them alone. So like having all three of them did more damage and it was more compromising for that patient than just having one or the other. And this had never been reported in civilians before. It had only ever been reported in military. So that was a cool discovery by the doctor who heads the clinic, and our team that we put together that paper. So I already talked about this. I guess I talked about this in terms of the twin study. So my job also outside of my PhD, like I said, I was the research director at a private medical clinic where we see patients who have had brain injuries. They've all been in car accidents. They come to the clinic. We do brain imaging. We do pain treatments, all kinds of stuff. My role there was as an electroencephalography technician and a neurofeedback therapist. So I ran all the brain scans and I did brain therapy with them. And I also did all the research that was going on there. And this study, so we had the last study that I just talked about, study 5, and now we're on to study number 6, the last study I'm going to talk about today, and then we're all done. I'm talking like you're like a class. I mean, if you just pause it or turn it off if you don't want to watch, I guess, or tune in late or watch like half and half. It might be a lot to just take in. But that's like what you tell your class, like you just encourage them. They know you're like almost done. It's like, are we there yet kind of thing. So you probably have tuned out by now already if you've been watching this whole thing. That's fine. You know what I mean? You can come back to it later. But this is one of the most exciting ones because it's all... I'll show you. It's like a whole picture of what's going on here, and it tells you a little bit about what I'm doing with the psychiatric data profile and the brain profile and the other one. It's the same kind of concept of what I did here. Here we took the psychiatric profile being patients with brain injuries, and we have the brain profile, and we measured them using EEG. So that's a picture of an EEG cap, this 19 lead cap there, and compared to an fMRI. So I talk about the clinical utility because we're in a clinical practice, a private practice. It's a building, like you go to the doctor's office. So in that type of setting, it's common to use a QEEG and EEG cap setup, also because it's like tens of thousands of dollars versus the millions of dollars for an fMRI machine, and the speed and the efficiency and the analysis and the recording is just unparalleled using EEG. Also, the rationale for using EEG in brain injury is because brain injuries ultimately cause a diffuse axonal injury, or sorry, I should say concussions. These mild traumatic brain injuries cause a diffuse axonal injury. So it doesn't even cause, which is a white matter damage. So damage to the white matter in your brain, the axons of your brain, which is what controls the electricity of your brain, which is what's measured by quantitative electroencephalography and then can be manipulated by electrical brain stimulation. fMRI generally measures the gray matter in your brain, the structure of your brain. So that's the big parts, So if you get a mild brain injury, that implies a concussion, which implies some shaking of the head, something internal. It implies a non-structural damage. So you wouldn't expect to see a structural change in gray matter from an MRI or an fMRI. So everybody gets sent to the hospital to get an fMRI or an MRI or a CT scan. But there's no reason to expect that there would be anything to see on the scan. And in fact, and that's what research shows, is that like 90% of the time you don't see any changes in concussion on these brain imaging tools. And that's why concussion is so a hot topic lately, is because it's kind of been rediscovered. Like, oh, it's an actual thing. Concussion's real. We didn't know it was real because we could never see it. And the reason you couldn't see it is because it's a functional damage to the brain. It damages the functionality of the brain by damaging the electrical transmission, because it damaged axons, which are the little cells that carry electricity from one neuron to another neuron. It doesn't damage the neurons, it doesn't damage the whole cortex, it damages the axons. It might do some damage to neurons and things through an inflammatory response, but it's the axons that receive the physical damage. So the absolute gold standard to evaluate that is something called diffusion tensor imaging, which lets you look at the diffuse axonal injury. But that's even more sophisticated and complicated than doing fMRI. And it's definitely not something you could do in like on scale with lots of people regularly. QEEG is a lot easier, so that's why we use it. And it's a lot more logical when it comes to measuring, because you're measuring the electricity of the brain, and that's what's changed in a concussion. So we use EEG to measure that. In this study, we had 57 patients who were been in car accidents and who have the psychiatric profile of somebody suffering from concussion. In other words, they are having cognitive symptoms, memory symptoms, fatigue, mood symptoms, all of this. And they've had this since the brain injury. They also have developed pain. In this sample, it wasn't the triad. They didn't necessarily all have post-traumatic stress disorder, but they all had the brain injury and they all had chronic pain. For more than at least 3 months, they've been suffering. Some cases, I think the longest was up to several years. So here's the methods. 57 patients. The average age of those patients was about 45 years old, 44 years old. And then we had 54 controls. So altogether we had 111 people in this study, 54 controls, healthy controls, and they were closely matched for age and sex. So we wanted to control for whether they were male female differences or age and sex difference or age differences. So if you look at the groups, we had 57 and 54, very close group numbers. The age was 44.6 to 43.5, very close. 16 to 21 males and 36 to 38 females, very close in the groups. The readout there is kind of an idea of what an electroencephalograph would look like. I realize I'm kind of like teaching a bit while I'm explaining this, because this is a lot of stuff I wouldn't have explained at Harvard, because they already they do this stuff. So I'm not teaching anything. I'm really, when I was there, I was just telling them about the research. And now that I'm realizing, okay, I'm teaching some of it, I'm thinking, well, if I actually was teaching this, I should have showed you a graph like this way earlier, right? And I would have set up things differently to teach you about EEG and brain stimulation and all that. But that wasn't the point of this, I guess. But I just realized that in terms of providing the explanation, it's been a bit necessary, or hopefully useful, that I did do at least a little bit of background teaching. But all really, it's high level stuff. So if I lost you a while ago, or if I lose you at some point, I totally understand, and that's fine. It's really, if I was trying to teach or educate about it, I should have done it in a more pedagogical way, a more teaching-oriented way, as opposed to a lecture to a Harvard laboratory group. Okay, so I'll spare you the data results slide here and just jump over to the more fun-looking slide. So basically what we are interested in is what electrophysiological profiles might define patients who had a concussion versus a patient who was healthy. And not just a patient, but rather 57 patients compared to 54 patients. And what differences emerged from that analysis. So we looked at a frequency spectrum. So earlier I talked about, very briefly at the beginning of the talk, about how theta power was found by Dr. Pizzigali's group, who I was interviewing for. They found that theta power could be used in the anterior cingulate cortex to predict depression. Here we find that delta and theta power are highly predictive of concussion as well. In specific, so delta is 0 to 4 hertz range. So when you're measuring brain activity, much like your heart, your brain has a rhythm. Everyone knows that your heart has a rhythm and it has a certain number of beats per second, right? Your brain also has a rhythm and a certain number of beats per second. Delta means that your brain is beating 0 to 4 times a second. Theta means your brain is beating 4 to 7 times a second. Alpha means it's beating 8 to 12 times. Beta low is 12 to 15 times a second. Beta high is 15 to 30 times a second. And gamma means 30 up to like hundreds of times a second that your brain is beating. So it has this full capacity. On a day-to-day basis, the average brain activity, the dominant frequency, is 8 to 12 hertz, which means on average your brain frequency is beating 8 to 12 times a second. You can look at the changes in this and in these ranges and the amplitude of that signal and the rate of that signal, so the rate of firing, the amount of firing, the size of it, and measure these factors to tell you something about one group versus another group. And here we found that delta activity, so red in this case, is indicative of an increase of activity in the patients. So people who have post-concussion syndrome have significantly elevated delta power, theta power, alpha power, beta power, all of them. But the most significantly elevated were delta and theta. Now, that doesn't mean, when I'm saying they had more delta power, theta power, alpha power, that doesn't mean their brain's working faster or better. Everyone's still at the same frequency, 4 hertz, 4 times a second, or 7 times a second. It's the amplitude. So think about amplitude as the amount of energy expenditure, the amount of energy it takes to do something. So when you compare a group of patients with concussion to a group of patients who are healthy, across all of the top frequencies in their brain, so their brain's still beating the same rhythm, but it's requiring a lot more energy to do that in every case, across from 0 hertz all the way up to 45 hertz. And specifically, it's requiring more energy in the low range. And we interpret this overall as, the type of abnormal activity that's going on in the brain and the type of expenditure and fatigue and cognitive deficit that is related to concussion as a result of the energy requirements demanded by the brain in order to just keep functioning the same way that it's supposed to. So what we see is a much higher demand for concussed patients to process information and do all these things, even at a resting state. So all these scans were just done at rest. They weren't even doing anything. And you compare that to an adult, a healthy adult, and you see that they don't have that same issue, and they don't have that brain abnormality. So they're able to do the same thing with much less energy expenditure. And anybody who's had a concussion can probably relate to that sentiment. So I just highlight here the delta and theta. So when you're looking at, from a statistical point of view, they're very, very statistically different. They have a lot of strength to this. I'll just suffice it to say a p-value of over 1 million odds to 1, and another p-value of over 100,000 odds to 1 kind of thing. This we show, it's very similar to the last slide, but it's comparing the relative power, so the relative energy expenditure between different frequency bands. So this is still saying there's certain energy expenditure required, but it's not from patients to healthy people. It's between those frequency bands. So what this is showing is a shift towards lower frequency bands. The higher the frequency band, the more beats per second, the more energy required in a healthy person. So in a concussed person, way more energy is required. So for anybody, the more beats per second, more energy you need. That makes sense, right? But Like the faster you want to go, the more energy output you require, the more energy input you have to put in. So that's already taxing for somebody with a brain injury. So then you can compare that across. So in the delta frequency, that's only 4 beats a second. 3, 4, right? So what we see here is a shift in patients who have concussion towards a lower frequency band. So a healthy person usually operates in the 8 to 12 frequencies, 8 to 12 beats a second in their brain, right? Here we see a massive decrease in alpha activity. That's why it's so blue. So that alpha is way down compared to healthy people, and the delta is way up. So scientifically, we call that a compensatory shift. In other words, the brain is compensating for these energy expenditures by shifting to a lower frequency band. And it's shifting to less beats per second in order to conserve energy. But then that means the energy output for delta becomes much higher. And delta frequency, being the lowest, is most commonly found and associated with deep sleep and sleep states. So imagine your brain, when you're throughout your day, you need it to be quick. You need to be working at 12 beats a second in order to process everything that's going on. But when you go to sleep, you don't want that happening. You want it to slow down. Now, mind you, when you're dreaming, your brain is processing lots of alpha waves, right? So you're dreaming, you're asleep. Your brain is processing alpha waves, that 12 hertz. So even though you're asleep, your brain's still beating that many times. And that's when you're dreaming, because it's like you're awake. But when you're in a deep, deep sleep, when you don't dream at all, your brain is in delta, which means you're only processing 4 times a second a signal, or even down to 1 or less than 1 a second, which makes sense for rest, right? If you want your brain to rest, you need to be slowed way down. If you want your body to rest. But delta activity, and that's also when you grow, that stimulates your adrenal and pituitary glands, and it provides growth and stuff. But if you're always in delta activity because you have a brain injury, so all these people are awake, people with brain injuries showing increased delta activity as this compensatory mechanism to slow down the brain. So not only do you have increased energy expenditure, you have a slowed down brain. And again, anyone who's had a concussion or heard about symptoms of a concussion, you can imagine and see how this brain profile is representative of what you see cognitively. The cognitive profile of a person with concussion matches very well with this and the types of symptoms that they have. So the brain is slowed down, it's using lots of energy just to do the same thing that it was doing before, and just trying to keep up with that. And those changes there show from the decrease in alpha, but the increase in delta power. This is the major findings of this study. And these are electroneurophysiological biomarkers. Delta activity, theta activity, alpha activity, those are biomarkers based on electrical activity in your brain, spike activity measured from an electroencephalography, which provides us with a profile based on your brain's electrical activity, which ultimately is saying how many times does your brain beat per second. That's kind of what it's saying. And we can see that these major shifts in people with concussion. Then we showed a correlation, which means a relationship between the amount of energy like wasted, this energy expenditure, in as a measurement of delta power and theta power and all the amplitude of these signals. We measured that and showed that it gets worse over time. So the longer that you've had concussion symptoms, so remember what I said earlier, like 75% of people recover from concussion? That's great, that's amazing. They don't show this stuff, or probably don't. Research, it's not, we didn't study that, so we can't say definitively, but this is people who suffered from concussion for more than 3 months. We don't necessarily know why, 75% of people seem to just get better after a concussion and like 25% of people continue to suffer. But we do know that that is the case, and that's generally the rough epidemiological number. But what we do know from this is that if you're, from this table I'm showing right now, through this correlation, if you're suffering from concussion and you've been suffering for months, then the amount of energy expenditure required to keep the brain doing the same thing, it gets worse over time. That continues to get worse. So you should get treatment as soon as possible. That's the message there. And I'll just show quickly, we did this in 2016 with 27 patients. We did it again in 2019 with 57 patients. So we had 27 patients, 27 controls. And then 2019, we had 57 patients, 54 controls. And you can see for the most part, we actually replicated on the left, on the top, we are looking at the absolute power. So the first row here, that's all red. We're looking at absolute power. The row under that, we're looking at relative power. The row under that, we're looking at the same absolute power, so the energy expenditure in 2019 group compared to the first row in the 2016 group. And then you can compare the bottom row to the second row here, and that's the relative power. And again, we see generally a replication of results. So that's all I wanted to show. Then we took it a step further, and we applied machine learning to this. We fed the machine all the data about brain injury and whether they're a control and whether they were a patient. And we did a tenfold multiplier, which means that we created, using artificial intelligence, you can call it that, we created artificial numbers based on all this data, and 10 times over. And then you use a holdout set, so you use about 60% of your data to train the machine, and then you test it on the other 40% of your data to validate the machine learning. And we got an incredible result of using, so these are 9 different machine learning algorithms that we applied, the lowest of which provided 66% accuracy and the highest of which presented 88% accuracy. And that means this machine learning model that I built is able to predict concussion from healthy using delta and theta frequency, this shift to the lower band, using that energy expenditure, up to 88% of the time accuracy, with 88% accuracy and a very high specificity and sensitivity, like 90 to 100%. Very promising as a biomarker, which means in theory, the way we would apply this is to say, if you come into the clinic, you get a brain scan, we can then compare your brain to this database and run these algorithms, and then we can try to determine whether or not you have a concussion, or better yet, because these are all post-concussion syndrome. Let's say you come into the clinic and you just had a concussion like that day, 24 hours, then we could try to predict whether or not 3 months from now you'll develop a concussion. That's the big play here. Can we predict that? Can we predict the outcome? And if we can, then we can change the treatment options and we can get you in early. Or if we can predict it and say, well, we can actually predict that you won't develop this with up to 88% accuracy, then we can say this is the treatment plan that you should do, or you probably recover with rest, and therefore you could return to playing sports within 1 week, 2 weeks. Or if we say you're at high risk for developing concussion symptoms months from now, then maybe don't play next week. Don't play the week after that, okay? Like, that's the type of thing that we're getting towards, and machine learning enables us to do that. Okay, here it is. I wasn't sure if I had this. So yeah, the precision is 100%, and the sensitivity is 75% with specificity 100%. So on average, that's like high 80% like 88 around that for accuracy. It's pretty exceptional. There are some studies that have been done similarly to this, but I believe this is the strongest I've seen for concussion. This is just comparing different markers. So the first machine learning, I made multiple machine learning models. The first one used delta and theta power. Then I tried one using just delta, and I tried one using every biomarker that we made. And it turns out the best machine learning model was the delta theta power one. So how do we help people? This is the end bit here. This is what happens to people and how we can identify the issues in the clinic. How do we actually help them? Well, we can use things like brain stimulation. We can use other treatments like medication, of course, but also we use something called neurofeedback therapy, where we basically we train you to realize by using brain imaging. We'll like show you your brain activity on a computer screen, and then we teach you how to control your brain activity in real time. So we talked about how many beats per second in your brain. We can can teach you how to control the energy expenditure to produce those things by displaying your own brain activity to you, kind of like looking into a mirror and fixing your hair. You're like, okay, I need to do this, and you have feedback from the mirror telling you what you need to fix. We show you your brain activity on a computer screen, and you just kind of learn over time how to manipulate that. It's very interesting, very cool. So that's a whole other topic and conversation. Where we're taking this next, well, we've made these models for concussion and pain. We want to try to make ones that can predict other diseases like post-traumatic stress disorder, and also differentiate, because most people don't come in with one condition. They have comorbidities. They have lots of disease, like lots of different mental health and neurological diseases, like the polytrauma clinical triad. That triad may very well show a different profile in the brain than somebody with concussion, and therefore you can't use the same algorithm to try to predict that. So you need to make new ones for each of these. So that's kind of where we want to take this. And we're also really interested in doing acute concussion. So we want to get people in right away, like day of concussion, day after concussion, within 48 hours. They come in as soon as possible so we can evaluate you, and that will also lead to much better prediction, because we have the initial data. If we know where you started and we see where you end, you can build amazing prediction models. But if we only see you at the end and we didn't know where you started, we can't reconcile that. You can do it with controls and other people, but using the same person and measuring them over time at multiple points that would be the best way to possibly do this. And that's what we hope to do. So we provide good evidence for using delta and theta power as a concussion biomarker. And yeah, we hope that we can use these biomarkers to help inform new treatments. And I got to say, I'm grateful for my team. I've got a wonderful team, my different professors, all the people I've worked with, all of our research assistants. There's quite a lot of them that I have worked under me on all these different projects. So all these projects I just presented today, I was the lead in some way or another. The one, study 5, I was the third author, but I was still kind of the manager of that team. Every other study, I'm the lead author, which means I ran the studies. It was me in charge. There was still I had a boss above me, still, supervisors in that way, but these were my projects in their labs. So all these things were done across 3 different labs I've been working in. And all this is not all of it was in my dissertation for my PhD, but all of this is stuff I've done since I started my PhD. So from like 2014 until now, these are all studies I've worked on. I've also, like I said, I have a handful of other studies that I've done. I think I presented 6 today, and I've got 6 other studies that I've finished as well. So like over a dozen things that I've been a part of in some way or another, or different things that are still coming. It's been a fun ride, and this was the Harvard lecture. This is what I presented. I presented my research to them, and it was very well received. I feel like it went quite well. I had a lot of good questions coming out of it from them. This was at like halfway through the day, so I'd spent most of the day, like, first of all, I came in so stressed, right? Because I didn't think I was going to make it. I was waiting in the airport Thursday night all night, and well, not overnight, but until late. I got home, late in the evening, let's say like 10 o'clock or something on Thursday night. I'm supposed to be on the next flight out at 7 a.m. Friday morning. So I'm getting to the airport by like 5 a.m. So I get home, I barely sleep, I'm barely sleeping. Then I get up after a few hours sleep. I get to the airport like 5 a.m. The flight doesn't end up leaving till 9. I'm supposed to be there starting the interview at 9:30, and I'm not even leaving. We land in Boston by 9:30, 10. So it was like 10 o'clock probably. Like I said, changed in the airport. Uh, got in an Uber, got right there, got started on everything by like 11:30. I had a few interviews already, like a few half an hours. Then I think by like 1 o'clock, even my lunch break was meeting all the research assistants who would be working for me, and that was my lunch to eat. And then after all that, it was okay. Now we give a lecture, so okay, go lecture for an hour. Still haven't slept, and the stress of being late and not making it, and finally did make it. Gave the lecture, and then finished the lecture. I had for like 4 more hours of interviews. And overall, I think the lecture went great, all things considered, given the timing, the stress, the sleep, and the technical difficulties that they had getting it up. But everybody, it all came together, and I think it all went very well. Now, I guess time for the big reveal, everybody. Time for the big reveal, as to, the outcome of the interview. If you waited this long and you came this far, I'm sorry. I can't tell you that I got the job. Unfortunately, it was offered to somebody else. Uh, like I said earlier, I'm at the earliest possible point. I'm not even upset about it. I was a bit bummed at first. Obviously, I was really looking forward to it. It was an incredible position. They have an amazing team, and shout out to them for being so hospitable and inviting, and for taking me this far already. And it would have been great to work with them, but what they ended up hiring a candidate who is much more senior to me. This was the earliest I could possibly apply for this position, anyways. Meaning, like a postdoc position, like you could do 1, 2, 3 postdocs, which is like 2 years at a time. For instance, being a scientist in a lab full time, and the only difference, like I know in a PhD, you're kind of already a scientist, but it's just not a very well paid scientist. And then a postdoc is like, well, now you're actually getting paid like a scientist. And then once you've been a postdoc for several years, the next step usually is you might get offered a professorship or an assistant professor, then professor, and basically you're just getting paid more and more every time, and it gets better. And so I'm just making that point because, like, I've been a scientist for years, yes, but now I'm kind of hiring for the next level, and so I've only been in it for, I've got like 6 years of research, 7. So there's people with 10, 15 who are kind of applying for the same position as me, and I understand that. And it just gives me encouragement, motivation to move forward, move on to the next thing, and keep making my research better and more relevant to what I'm trying to do, which was another major thing. All things considered, too, it was their whole lab, the Harvard lab I was applying for at McLean's there. They're all about major depression research. Very interesting, and I'm totally into it. But if you looked at everything I talked about today, barely any of my research is about depression. Pardon me. The main reason that they were interested in me was in, the senior roles I played as a research director, my experience using electroencephalography, and my experience working with phenotypes and psychiatric profiles, comparing to brain profiles and machine learning. Their lab does all that stuff. I'm doing it in like ADHD and in brain injury and pain. They do it all in depression. So, there's some other factors like that unfortunately didn't play well for me. They didn't actually mention any of that to me. I'm just assuming that was part of the decision. So anyway, I'm not that bummed about it. Basically, I get to just keep on doing what I was doing in Ottawa, which is what I already like doing and what already makes me happy. So I mean, like, I really can't complain. Like, I've already had a good life here doing what I'm doing, and now I didn't get it, so I just get to keep having a good life here. Like, there, it's hard to be upset. It would have been exciting. It would have been a very different path. It would have been cool, but this is the way it is. That's cool. So that's that. Thanks for listening to the whole episode. If you did make it this far, or thanks for jumping to the end to find out what the outcome was. Either way, your interest in my success or failure is truly means a lot. Just the fact, and thanks so many people who already have reached out to me, because I haven't actually. Well, I've told some people I didn't get in, but I only just found out like a few days ago, like the end of last week or on the weekend, that I didn't get in, and like weeks had gone by because they were only doing one candidate a week, uh, in person and stuff. So I really didn't know what the outcome was going to be. So here we are, and I get to just keep on working on everything I got going here, and I have some new projects and working on my neurotechnology company and my own companies, and I'm applying for some other full-time scientist type stuff, but also some full-time entrepreneur grants that I can get through different, like some as neuroscience, some as like just strictly business grants and that sort of thing. So that's kind of where I'm thinking I'm heading with this all for the next couple of years, and we'll reevaluate and see where things go after that. But I appreciate the opportunity to have gone there and done the interview, and I understand that it's a very competitive market, and I'm just going to keep on working hard and getting to it. So thanks for bearing with me. I hope you learned something or found something enjoyable about this episode, and please write in with questions if you have anything. You can write to Matt Buchanan Studios at gmail.com if you have any questions about the lecture or about anything else that went on. But that was it. That was the Boston lecture. I'm going to talk a little bit more in the next episode about Boston, the comedy scene there, and then New York as well, the comedy that went from there. So I didn't want to talk about all the Boston stuff in this one because it's the rest of what I did there was mostly comedy related. So I'm saving that for the New York episode. And that was Harvard. Hopefully, I'll have another opportunity sometime. If you didn't know, or I mean, you might see it on the wall. I actually do have a certificate from Harvard that I got in 2015 for brain stimulation, like for transcranial direct current stimulation. That I went there, in 2015 to get that, and so all it bodes for all the studies that I did and that I talked about at the beginning of this lecture, that I do have proper credentials for that as well. But I don't have. I didn't get a full-time position there. That's all right. It's all right, everybody. Thanks so much. Stay happy. Stay healthy.